Hello, and welcome to a special Christmas episode of the Emancipated Citizen podcast. I'm Ben, and this is Zach. So we figured we'd do something special for Christmas. It was either puppies and kittens in Ukraine and Syria. The only sources we could find were one that focuses on U.S. veterans and dogs and bringing pets from war zones for American soldiers. I just did a side project in Ukraine and showed Kuban as part of Ukraine, which has a lot of questions that we're not going to discuss now. So instead, we decided to go with human rights and how they are recognized in Westeros and the Game of Thrones universe, and just some of the parallels we have with our own world.
I think the concept of human rights, or applying this concept of universal human rights to a universe like that of Game of Thrones, obviously is a bit anachronistic, and yeah, you can't apply those understandings one to one. But I do believe that those basic principles, the basic drives that people have, people in power, people reaching for power, people in those positions, and the interactions with the people under them does reflect like I suppose a universal intuition of something very reminiscent of that, or that aligns with that on a certain intuitive level. So we thought we would talk about them as human rights from now on in the world of Game of Thrones, Westeros, Essos. We don't know what's beyond that. Maybe we'll find out in the future.
And how different times, different factions did explicitly recognize rights, or at least not try to deny them to anyone else. The followers of the Red God come to mind. They were not tolerant the way the followers of the Seven and the Old Gods in Westeros were. I guess the beginning of the story. Zach, have you read Fire and Blood?
I have not read Fire and Blood. I did read the original Song of Ice and Fire books, watching the original Game of Thrones show. But the new show, I watched it cold without reading any of the source material. I imagine that the case is kind of the opposite with you, Ben, right?
Yeah, I read the books first, then watched the show, and read Fire and Blood a couple years ago. And the new show, it actually is not just a dramatization of Fire and Blood. Fire and Blood takes place over several centuries. Show obviously takes place over a couple of decades at most.
Yeah, so like an expansion of a specific portion of a history of supposed history telling, and as opposed to a dramatization, right?
Yeah, and cites different sources, talks about the strengths and weaknesses of different sources as historical documents. One was by a dwarf who was the fool for the queen, who was the daughter of the king. He doesn't show up in the show, sadly. Before the Targaryens arrived, different factions building different castles. North was pretty much the same. The Targaryens didn't change that much in the north, except that the Starks called themselves Lords of Winterfell, Wards of the North, blah, 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 instead of the king in the north. But otherwise, most of the other family of the royal families were toppled and had their immediate servants take over, or a rival, somebody who played the role that the Boltons played to the Starks take over, stuff like that. I think only two of them managed to keep their thrones after the Targaryens arrived. But throughout the kingdom, it was recognized that the Lord had the right to first night. In our world, that was called prima nocta, where on a wedding night the bride would sleep with her husband's lord, not with her husband. In our world, that was always something somebody was saying was a right in another kingdom over, so their peasants should be grateful. That was not actually the law in any particular land.
Okay, but was that ever actually applied in the real world, as far as we know?
No, as far as we know, that was always just something lords in the real world were saying about next kingdom over, a couple kingdoms over. why the peasants shouldn't go to the next kingdom over. In Westeros, it was actually a thing, and it continued to be a thing after the Targaryens arrived. It was still a thing on Dragonstone for a long time, the seat of the Targaryens. A few generations after the Targaryens took over, the queen insisted that it end and be outlawed because it was leading to all sorts of abuse. Said that in the early days, the lord would be a hero who women would be glad to sleep with, not some fat old lord who sits on his butt in a castle.
Okay, I have a question. First, like we kind of established that there has through history been this talk about this phenomenon of prima nocta, but we don't have any direct evidence of that actually happening, but of it more being kind of a threat and yeah, like making the peasants to be scared of the other essentially. I suppose implicitly there does like the hypothesis does stand there or even the assumption possibly that this phenomenon is made up for propaganda purposes to kind of demonstrate that I am better than the other king over there. Would that be the conception that you would have of that in the real world?
Yes, that's my conception of it. In the real
So,
world,
so in Westeros, do you think the same might be possible, where with the Targaryens having ruled over for like 300 years, but by that point, that this might also be fictive in the same way and for very similar political purposes?
for it to have been explicitly banned in Fire and Blood, they talk about how the queen who convinced the king to ban it would have meetings with or the women's councils, where she'd meet women while they were traveling around the kingdoms, and specifically mentioned in Mole Town how at least one of them said she was there because their lord insisted on the right of first night, and her husband got jealous and abused her from the very beginning of their marriage because of it. And then Lord Bolton actually does it way in the original books.
Yeah,
And spoiler
I
alert,
mean, Bolton says, well, he says to Ramsay that he did it. Yeah, that's how Ramsay came about it. I don't know why he would lie about that.
also, most importantly, and spoiler alert for season 2 of whatever they're calling the prequel series,
Okay,
where it
good.
ended. You think that's the end? There's definitely going to be a season 2.
I mean, there's definitely going to be a season two, but I don't know what's going to happen then.
The princess who was declared the heir, her faction, goes and finds
The
people.
Black Faction.
The black faction. I was moving when I watched it. They go and find descendants of Targaryens born through the First Night, artist general lords pouring around. Either way, bastard children of Targaryens who can ride on dragons to increase their numbers of dragon riders.
Yeah.
I suspect it's going to come up pretty fast in season 2.
What does that have to do with Prima Nocta?
Point being that in the Westeros universe, it was going on a Dragonstone without
Oh
any.
yeah, yeah. So the Targaryens were also doing it.
Yes.
Okay, okay. I suppose I'm convinced that is a real thing in Westeros then.
And
Yeah.
granted, this is written by somebody whose patron is the Targaryens, but he said that the people of Dragonstone didn't object to it the way people on the mainland objected to random lords having their first night, because they felt like the Targaryens they're almost gods and it was an honor to raise their bastard children. But, as in the real world history sources, you need to take things like that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and who was the queen that outlawed that in the end?
I think it would have been Alysanne, who was the third queen. Actually, it's
Okay,
very hard to make sense of the Targaryen family tree with Aegon having children with both his sisters and whatnot. But it looks
the
like
third.
it would have been the wife of the third king in the dynasty, if you ignore Maegor being Maegor.
Okay, the first king was Aegon. The second king was Aenys. And the third king was Maegor, and the one after that was Jaehaerys.
Yeah, Jaehaerys' wife, yes.
Okay. So Jaehaerys' wife was responsible for the abolition of this practice.
As I recall, go ahead and at me on Twitter, I won't see it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess he is remembered for sovereignty, stability, being level-headed.
Whereas
But
Maegor, the third Targaryen ruler, had a harem of 20 women. Sounded like they may not have been entirely consensual, as a stopgap in case he didn't get a full-blooded Targaryen heir.
yeah, I mean, the concept of consent is something that I think in our Western bubble we kind of take for granted, and it's kind of hard to imagine what this kind of thing looks like within a framework where you're essentially told that what the king says is what is right, and what you're supposed to do. Political elites say, when and also when that's where you get your housing and everything else and your means to live, basically,
Yeah.
right?
And where marriages are decided by usually mainly by the parents.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if a marriage is decided by the parents who have complete economic control over, say, the woman in this situation, or even a man in a lot of situations, the person is very likely to agree to whatever is put in front of them, or maybe have some room to negotiate within some framework, right? But their final decisions on what to do there is very much tied to the support of other people and the leaders of the group that they belong to. Even traditional marriage throughout most of history, even in the real world, doesn't take into account this modern concept of consent that we have now. It was in a lot of societies seen as a sort of transaction, economic, social. In essence, the man or the man's family or tribe would be giving up something for the right over this girl or this woman and propagate the family line and so on.
Well, except for the minor detail that in a lot of societies, Western society included, until very recently, it was the bride's family who would be giving the groom money to support their daughter, as though their daughter was an economic burden. But if you compare India and Africa, in India, it's the bride's family that gives a dowry, not the groom's, and women have a few more rights in even the most traditional places in India than they would in Africa. Or at least it's understood in India that a woman's decision about how many children it have is mainly her own decision, whereas in Africa, where the husband's family paid a tremendous amount of money for her to marry him, she does not have nearly as much control over her own fertility.
Yeah, that is an aspect of it where women can have higher or lower degrees of control over that aspect of marriage and those relationships. But I think especially when it comes to kings and what they want, it's very difficult to ever speak of something being consensual.
Although I wonder how different it is for anything king does to be consensual versus a CEO of a major corporation or a billionaire being consensual. Although I guess no billionaire can just say or out with his tongue or off with his head.
Yeah, it's not the same. I mean, you can think of specific cases where one can abuse this power, but even then, this understanding that a violation is being made here, and at least in principle, having a legal framework for that, largely scraps that concern. I think a billionaire wouldn't have the power to punish any random person that they meet. It does have to specifically pertain to their holdings, uh, things that have to do with employment, housing. Like if it very directly hits those very specific points, and someone with those means directly makes the threat of, for example, you're going to be evicted or fired if you don't let me have my way with you, then we already have a legal framework for that, and a clear place for where that belongs. So I think modern society has developed the proper understanding of that in that kind of
Yeah,
scenario.
good
Uh,
point. Yeah, I guess it
in
doesn't really
in
compare to
context, yeah,
a Lord
it's like a
Westerosi over
harem in
medieval.
a king's harem, right?
Yeah. Do we want to roll over to another set of rights?
Sure.
I guess the big one after marriage basically being a form of slavery for so long is slavery itself. In the Game of Thrones series, yeah, in Westeros, it was banned. Maybe Fire and Blood didn't talk about a specific time when it was banned, but it sounds like it was banned throughout the mainland. However, it was commonplace in the Iron Islands, and the Iron Islanders believed that it was right to enslave people. However, they weren't able to as long as the powers in Westeros was able to keep them under control. And among the real world equivalents of the Iron Islanders, the Vikings, it was common and they had trade networks that stretched from Ireland to Russia and into northern Africa where they would trade slaves. Possibly even before the Targaryens arrived.
Like, as far as I remember, it was the Andals that first banned slavery in Westeros because they believed in the faith of the Seven, and I think that's this religious institution that was involved in abolishing slavery in Westeros, which in
Yeah,
contrast
although
to Essos and the rest of the world and that
from the
universe.
sound of it, it doesn't sound like the first men were really big into slavery either, though.
There's not much that I don't think there's much that's said about that in the canon, honestly, and it is a bit of a disappointment that like I guess like off the top of my head there isn't that much material to reach back to there. Kind of attitude towards slavery. What was the reason? The specific like religious doctrines that made it so that yeah, slavery was taboo within this faith of the Seven.
Yeah, well, I mean, the wildlings call themselves the free folk. Don't even like the concept of lord and vassal. They most certainly wouldn't tolerate slavery. But it did actually get mentioned in Fire and Blood that they mentioned a specific long winter, but kind of with the implication that it happened in all the long winters, where bad men would sell their families into slavery so they could eat, and good men would sell themselves into slavery so their families could eat, not other people in Westeros to foreign slave traders, I guess directly in exchange for food.
Even despite the lack of background information we have, the societal development, it is something that Westeros seems to be far ahead of Western civilization, or
I
in
would say
much of
so.
anywhere in the real world, really, or
Yeah.
yeah, I guess Western, or more specifically, like British civilization is what Westeros is mainly based on.
Yeah, well,
But
I would actually argue that Westeros is about on par with British specifically and Western European society in general up until the 1400s or so. Because in the 1400s, there was not slavery not only was there not slavery in Western Europe, there hadn't been for centuries. Fun linguistic evidence for that. The Latin word for slave was servus, and in Latin sources after the fall of the Roman Empire, it starts to mean house servant, hence how we have the term servant, could mean as a peasant, and you just need to use context to figure out exactly what the term servus meant in Latin documents. However, the word slave, and in German Sklav, well, it's not a coincidence it sounds so much like Slavic people. There was not really much slavery in Western Europe in the 800s, even. Christianity didn't specifically say no slavery at all, but don't enslave other Christians. Islam very much said slavery was okay, just don't enslave other Muslims. So the Slavs were the only people around who were still pagan, north of the Sahara. So there's this huge slave trade in Slavic people, the men would get castrated and they'd get sold on into Muslim lands. There wasn't much use for them in Western Europe, but there's a slave trade to the caliphate because they had a huge demand for it. And they started using the term Slav to mean slave because they had all these Slavic slaves going mostly en route to being exported. I actually just recently watched a YouTube video about that.
Interesting. So it seems that through this homogenization through Christianity and within Europe, like it started at a point where you can enslave people, just not other Christians. And as Christianity expanded further and further to the west until they hit the ocean, basically, and there isn't a further frontier to kind of invade and be able to take slaves from in the same way that they were before. The slave trade kind of had to die on its own at that point.
I mean, actual historians debate about it endlessly, but it sounds like they're just slavery wasn't economically viable. And if you think about it, it does kind of make sense. To have a peasant who owes you labor dues, you have a contract that says he gets to farm a plot of land and has to do some work in your fields or has to pay you a portion of his earnings. Incidentally, it was the land that had those services. If a free peasant who did not owe labor dues bought land from a unfree peasant who did, the free peasant would suddenly have to do labor in the lord's personal fields. But anyway, point being, though, that was easier because you don't need to have a staff of guards on duty 24 hours a day to make sure none of your slaves run away. You don't need to have a whole bunch of patrols for escaped slaves. It was just made more sense just to have peasants who you split the produce with instead of having a bunch of overseers and having to constantly make sure your slaves didn't rebel.
Back to the world of Westeros. Am I correct to see a distinction between this moral taboo that the Faith of the Seven places on slavery and this kind of pragmatic phasing out of slavery in most of Western Europe? Despite it ideologically and legally not being outlawed in much of the area. I mean, I think was slavery legal in Britain since the 1600s or something? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
actually, I'm not sure if slavery was ever really legal in Britain itself, just allowed in their colonies.
But that's the point I was getting to in the colonies, and then especially in the Americas. The Europeans really didn't seem to have any issue having slaves and using slave labor. Do you also see this distinction between this attitude and the moralistic rejection of slavery by the Faith of the Seven?
If we pretend George R. R. Martin was getting psychic readings from a place that actually exists, I suspect that it would just be the future historians looking on the past and seeing a moral component to a decision that probably wasn't entirely based on morals, but also had a lot to do with economics. But I mean, the Faith of the Seven is largely based on Christianity. They just have seven deities instead of three and give more explicit genders to them.
Yeah, and it's also said in a lot of places that the seven are like different manifestations of one God,
Yeah,
but in a sense,
just like the
yeah,
Trinity is a manifestation, is three manifestations of one God in Christianity.
yeah, exactly.
If Europeans didn't die in such large numbers in the Caribbean, I'd say there's a good chance that we never would have had slavery in the Americas if they could have just kept on bringing over peasants who wanted to work in somewhere other than where they were born. If they didn't just die of malaria and yellow fever so quickly, they probably would have just kept doing that.
On a slightly unrelated note, about the Faith of the Seven, I did learn very recently about like in neo-pagan beliefs, especially in Wicca. Seems like George R. R. Martin may have adopted elements from there because there is this triple goddess that's revered in like a lot of like Wicca circles,
I
and it's manifested in three figures: the maiden, the mother, and the crone.
But no, that was three Slavic goddesses who are also three in one, maiden, mother, and crone. They actually show up in American Gods, where you have three goddesses of different ages. The maiden is awake at night. No, the three of them aren't always awake at the same time, but maiden at night, crone in the evening, mother in the morning, I think. But typically two of them will be awake at any particular time.
Yeah,
At least
yeah,
that's how it's expressed in American Gods. I haven't heard about it from actual mythology because Slavic mythology is so underrepresented.
yeah. So all in all, how would you view the faith of the seven in regards to the dignity that they give to the human being and
Yeah. I mean, they all specifically represent different aspects of being human. I guess they represent men a little better than women because they just do the three different stages of womanhood, whereas the male half has the smith, the warrior, and the father. So I
yeah,
guess different ages aren't represented, but different things men do. Well, I guess most men become fathers, at least in their ideal conception. And then you can either be a smith or other craftsman or a warrior. Whereas
yeah.
the women, it's just their life stages, which I guess is interesting, but I don't think the books don't really explore it how women and men get treated differently there. Except I guess that women aren't really distinguished by their station in life to quite the same extent that men are. They're all be seen as an extension of their husbands.
Yeah, in society in general, and I don't know how much this faith specifically has to do with it because a lot of this also carries over to places where the same faith isn't practiced, but within the faith of the seven and the hierarchy of the clergy, is there a distinction between men and women that you're aware of?
I think they have different orders that represent different parts because they had the militant factions of the faith, the warriors' sons who were all knights, and the poor fellows who I guess were the faith's equivalent of footmen, except of course, but they got banned because after the conquest because they're too much of a headache for the Targaryens.
Yeah, yeah. So I suppose you have the poor fellows, those knights, the higher priests, and the only position that women can really get into is kind of a septa, the like a non-position that mostly has to do with dealing with other women, right? Things like
Yeah,
that.
and in our world, nuns actually did a lot of important administrative stuff, and the head of a convent was in a position very similar to a lord. And they don't really talk about it in the books, but I suspect a lot of septas were actually doing pretty important administrative tasks.
No. Would you say it's like just as patriarchal as like the Catholic Church?
Maybe. And I mean, the medieval Catholic Church wasn't quite as patriarchal as people think it was.
Really?
Yeah, just the amount of power that nuns, particularly the abbesses, would have was a lot more than historians didn't necessarily write about it much, but I mean, there were bisexual monasteries. There was one famous nun who made her own abbey to took away all the nuns from the bisexual monastery, and the abbot was pissed.
The bisexual monastery?
Oh,
Oh,
have both men and women in it, not a monastery full of bisexuals. My
okay.
history professor specifically said that not a monastery full of bisexuals. After she said that, I should have done that too.
Yeah, I mean, a monastery full of bisexuals. That sounds like fun, actually. Being trapped in a convent with a bunch of bisexual nuns.
Yeah, except of course in this case it was both sexes.
I mean, still, I'd be down for it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, they don't talk about what the male side of the faith does either very much. They talk about the first High Septon being kind of useless, overweight, and corrupt, and he gets literally eaten by a crowd.
He gets literally eaten by a crowd.
Yes, he gets literally eaten by the angry crowd that
So
gang raped the woman that Bronn married in the books but did not marry in the show.
yeah.
And in the show that attack Sansa until the Hound rescued her.
Yeah, and this High Septon was the one that came after the Targaryens abolished other parts of the order, right?
Yeah, well, the
Or
warriors'
before.
sons and poorfellows were their own orders. The Septons had always been there.
Yeah, and that happened after the Poor Fellows and then the Warrior Sons were
No,
abolished.
I think the Septons and poorfellows coexisted before the Targaryens banned the poorfellows and warriors'
Okay.
sons. Just like the Catholic Church had always had bishops and priests, and then at some points had the Templars and Hospitallers too, and then banned the Templars because their vows not to take up arms against other Christians came to be counterproductive for the church's activities in the future.
Yeah, but still, my question: would that kind of thing have happened if those warriors and poor fellows were an active part of the religious structure? Because I feel like this is the kind of thing that might happen as a result of an interruption of this balance by, for example, the Targaryens abolishing large parts of it. Or am I completely wrong there?
Yeah, he probably would have had, maybe he would have had better bodyguards. I guess if the orders hadn't
Better
been abolished,
representation as
it
well.
wouldn't have made
Yeah.
much of a difference, I don't think.
And then it's not just protection; it's about representation and prestige as well, right?
I don't think that it was actually relevant to it though. Actually, if anything, it may have been that the faith may have been more tyrannical if they hadn't been abolished. Because it sounds like the armed wing of the faith was played a much bigger role before the Targaryens arrived. They probably were another armed faction that I guess kept the pre-Targaryen lords a little on their toes, but just the Targaryens had the power to ban them, so they did. So the Targaryen, because they're a threat to the Targaryens' power too. I suspect it was a lot like the Catholic Church when they had crusading orders to do their work for them and could also run inquisitions. Maybe there would have been inquisitions in Westeros if they hadn't been banned.
Evidently, the this exclusivist aspect of Islam and Christianity has been integral to their success throughout history, and the fact that up until the events of the main show in Game of Thrones, this aspect of religion has not become dominant anywhere in the world, really. I
I
do
bet.
wonder if at some point maybe the Lord of Light is on a trajectory to geopolitical dominance or something like that, especially without the power of the dragons
Also,
to
because
that.
some of his followers can raise the dead, that's going to give him certain advantages in the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, most definitely.
And I wonder if we're going to get some better explanation of that in the books that are yet to come than we got in the show.
In the real world, people like you and me are used to viewing and analyzing religion as development of human hierarchies within societal structures, and try to think about the elements that made Christianity successful and Islam successful, and through like ideological elements and things like that, try to project things. Yeah, geopolitical success in the past or in the future, or potential possibilities of different kinds of success that they might have, right? And that's all based on this naturalistic worldview. But are we neglecting the possibility that in this fictional universe, some of those faith traditions might be actually based on real spiritual beings, real deities communicating with humans and
Yeah,
acting within the real world to lend them power and that kind of thing?
yeah, and we know that the old gods sort of are, except the old god at the end of the series is Bran.
I think George R. R. Martin is very good at keeping this so ambiguous that when he talks about magic, for example, it says like you can't have exact formulas and exact recipes and things like that, because once the methodology gets too exact and you know how the process works, then it's not magic anymore, it's science, right? So you do need to keep a certain element of mystery and certain questions that are left unanswered there. And there are no definitive answers of a religion being true or false, or from a true deity or not, or that kind of thing. And I think it's deliberately so. Even though he does lean into the supernatural and giving them some plausibility in a lot of ways, it's never made that clear anywhere.
Whereas a lot of other fantasy authors actually, there's actually one who actually made a list of rules of magic, and one is it has to be consistent in a way that you can't also be ambiguous at the same time. Like magic can't just magically let you do anything, there has to be limits to it. But no, in Westeros and the rest of the universe, magic is real, and yet we don't see witch burnings.
I mean, if witches were real, nobody would dare burn them, right? People burn people for being witches because they know they can't fight back. And historically, and even like in the modern world, people who are victimized by things like witch burnings and witch hunts, witch persecutions, are most often like people on the lowest end of the socioeconomic people, like in the Americas, mostly people of native origin,
Well,
people
no, not
who
in
were
Salem.
enslaved, people who were enslaved, right, in Salem. Like I
No,
think so.
there was
No,
there was one enslaved girl who was accused because she was introducing her traditional practices. You also have to keep in mind that there was also a bunch of accusations from girls who were caught doing weird stuff that was considered ungodly because it was traditional African stuff. But one of them was explicitly told by her mother to go see if Tituba, the slave girl, could find out who killed her baby brother. But I mean, it wasn't. It also wasn't necessarily the poorest people. Giles Corey was not poor. It was his neighbor who coveted his property, who wanted to accuse him of witchcraft to steal his property. And a lot of times the Inquisition was people in the church targeting the rich people because then they could get their property.
it does have to do with power imbalance in some sense, and also,
And
um,
and I mean, where I was in Zambia, it wasn't just the poorest people who were at risk. I mean, they'd also it was assumed that the people in that the chiefs and had some magical power, and they
yeah,
would be
okay,
secretly
okay.
buried because of it too.
Assuming that someone has magical power is not the same as persecuting someone for being a
Yeah.
witch. So like going back to the Salem witch trials, I do believe that the first women who were accused there were lower people in society being accused by people of higher social positions like servant girls and so on. And it did get to a point of mass hysteria where everyone was accusing everyone, and they came to a point of, yeah, we can't do that anymore, right? And
And there's also a servant girl who accused her mistress of being a witch too. In the Crucible, because she was having an affair with the husband. Unlikely to be true in real life. The girl was in her late teens, and in the Crucible, he was aged down to 40 or so. In real life, he was in his 60s, so that's probably not the case. But yeah, there's a servant girl who accused her mistress of witchcraft. It wasn't a one-way street at the very least.
I think I'd see those cases as exceptions, but I very well might be wrong there. I'm not as deep into this topic as you can probably tell as I should be.
It's
But
it's a convenient
also
accusation for anyone because it's impossible to prove false.
yeah, but also in Saudi Arabia, for example, the surrounding region, the most common group that is accused of witchcraft are, yeah, like domestic servants that come from places like India and yeah, African countries, and basically the poorest parts of the world. And it would be laughable for someone to accuse a princess of being a witch, for example.
Yeah, I mean, how much of that is also involves religion too, though?
It does. It does involve religion, but what I'm saying is that those ideas aren't. They're only used to persecute the weakest members of society.
And why? How does accusing your house cleaner of witchcraft help you when you can just have her deported?
I don't really know. Like the stories that you do hear about this kind of thing are, yeah, about that. Yeah, I think Yeah, anyway, the point I was trying to make is that if witchcraft was a real thing, if there were people who had the power to, cast spells, make people fall in love, make people fall out of love, like all the things that you associate with magic, which is a very broad kind of spectrum of things. Those would be very powerful people that other people would want favors from, would want to use, that would want to be friends with, right? Would want to have them in their government. They wouldn't be at the margins of society. If witches were real, they would be at the very top of society, I think.
Could go either way. I mean, economically important people are often pushed to the sidelines. A lot of times, iron workers are under nobles, but they're certainly very skilled and very important.
Yeah.
Although I guess a village blacksmith is probably a more important person than other random peasants, but still. I suspect if magic was real and people were actually using it to exploit them, they would be made lesser than people in power if they didn't take power themselves.
Yeah, so moving on to the events of the main Game of Thrones show and the Song of Ice and Fire books, who do you think could be said to be the greatest champion of human rights?
In some ways, definitely Daenerys because she was fighting against slavery, trying to make it end until the very end of the series, which was I suspect may not have happened if George R. R. was still in the writers' room. She was very much against capriciously executing people, very much in favor of rule of the law. She says someone tells her she's the law, and she says no, the law is the law. And refuses to just let murders go happen willy nilly because they're convenient to her. But
Yeah.
in Varys, I mean, he doesn't respect people's proper privacy, and he probably should have stuck his neck out a few times when he didn't. But he certainly doesn't want people being capriciously murdered. And he also makes his comment about how torture will get you answers, but they're very often the wrong answers. My job is to get the right answers.
Yeah, he gets points for being against torture, but I think most importantly, when it comes to Varys, he is probably my favorite character because he's the only one who is primarily concerned with the good of the realm, of everyone, of the common people, and isn't like he's not interested in being on the throne himself. He's not interested in getting positions of power that are that much higher than he already has. I think yes, he is he can be ruthless and he is very pragmatic. Yeah, when it comes to especially when he's in those difficult situations like with Ned. But I think he is at least the one with the most noble motives for playing the game.
I guess Ned Stark, to him and to Northerners in general, oaths are super important. You do not break them. However, he also wants the best for his people and for the realm as a whole.
Yeah, but I have a hard time seeing this in the light of human rights and universal human well-being, right? Because like what Ned is about is traditionalism and tribalism, legalism. Yeah. I mean, yeah, watching out for his own people, his own family, his own group.
I didn't really see that though. Also, I just started rewatching the show with my girlfriend who hasn't watched it before. So maybe it's a little more fresh to me, but it sounds like he's very much like a Canadian: peace, order, and good government. He doesn't seek his own ambitions. It doesn't sound like he's overly interested in the Starks doing better than the other nobles.
I suppose, but also I do feel like how do I explain this? I feel like it is. I think he's very concerned with stable government and prosperity of the realm in that sense, continuity, legitimacy. But I just don't see him as someone who would champion the participation or the consideration of the common people. He is very aristocratic in that sense,
He's
in contrast
aristocratic
to
in a weird
figures like.
northern way. It's very different from southern aristocrats.
Yeah,
Kind
but
of
I mean, put that in contrast with the very personal relationships and struggles that people like Daenerys and Varys have throughout the series.
Also, we didn't see him do it, but I'm sure he did it, where he would personally meet with people, commoners who needed him to resolve disputes and whatnot. We see Bran doing it, but that was just because the others were gone. I'm sure Ned Stark must have done it too. It definitely sounds like Ned Stark would have done that himself when he wasn't off in King's Landing. Whereas the Lannisters most certainly didn't do that, and didn't sound like maybe the Tyrells would have, but not anyone else.
Also, I think Daenerys is in a lot of ways lost opportunity with the way that her character arc ended up looking, because even starting out from this like family of monarchs and striving to regain her birthright, so to speak, and rule over Westeros. I think she, like, at least at first, was doing this from a place of self-preservation and like going the place where you can and are supposed to go in that position. Especially after the current king, Robert Baratheon, tries to assassinate her, and it seems like it's either her or them. From her perspective, it is kind of the only way to have a continuation of her own and her family lines continuation or existence. And I think through a lot that she has gone through, and that the suffering that she has seen through her life, through her development, she has come to accept a certain sense of responsibility towards the people she rules over, and a obligation to provide them with a level of autonomy and dignity that they otherwise wouldn't have. And things like the abolition of slavery became a major theme there.
And I
Um,
think a lot of that was just because the near worship of the slaves made her realize how important freedom was, or the near worship of newly freed slaves. Also, she was kind of thrown in over her head. In the book she kept on saying, "If I look backwards, I am lost."
So what you're saying is that this has more of a political angle to it, gaining those people's support. Then
No, not at all. I think she was so traumatized and so thrown in over her head because in the books she was only 14 when it all started.
yeah.
I think she was 16 at the point she took her first city at most, and she just had to keep on going. She wasn't necessarily thinking rationally.
Yeah, I guess did what felt right for her at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think this also aligns with like this revolutionary figure. All this talk about breaking the wheel, having the people have this autonomy, have this dignity.
Did the
Being
phrase break the wheel ever come up in the books, though, at least to the point where they're at now?
No, no, because in the book Tyrion hasn't yet gotten to Daenerys, as far as I remember.
Huh, okay. Need to reread them.
I do see this revolutionary spirit in Daenerys to a degree. Even though she did come from, on the one hand, a very privileged background, in another sense, it's.
Well, not that privileged, being in
Yeah.
exile since she was 3 days old.
In another sense, that's what I'm saying. It's very, very difficult, very close to pain and oppression, and she has at least like experienced either first or second hand a lot of abuse, a lot of hardship, and has come to kind of recognition or conviction that power should be held to certain limits. Yeah, you can't have absolute power over someone, and like a universal human right to freedom, for example, does and should be implemented. At the same time, she's living in a world where those principles aren't accepted, and she's being fought every step of the way. Yeah, also by very dangerous and ruthless people. So she finds herself having to make a lot of decisions that aren't necessarily merciful or empathetic or dignified for the other person, just to hold on to that power. And this is something that you see with a lot of revolutionary figures in history. Like Lenin comes to mind, right?
Maybe it's my Eastern European heritage and connections coming out, but I think he was a bit hypocritical. Like, there's a time when he got very upset about somebody taking his personal property, just
Yeah,
a couple cows to be precise.
I don't think that it's that out of place for a communist not to want to be stolen from just because, they have those ideals. I don't see the contradiction there, to be honest. What I mean about Lenin is he starts out as at least on the surface, as this very democratic figure, and ends up having to make decisions between the possibility of real democracy and his faction maintaining power. And in the other scenario, even that isn't guaranteed, you can really see the struggle. I think an even closer example there would be during the French Revolution, Maximilien Robespierre, who was in the committee that sentenced King Louis XVI to death. And after that, of course, who was sitting over and directing what's called the Great Terror in the 1890s, where tens of thousands of people were killed by the guillotine.
Although I have heard that that actually wasn't nearly that many people.
I can't confirm nor deny that. Honestly, there's just the numbers that in the high school history books usually cited.
German or Saudi?
German. You don't learn about those things in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, I thought maybe the Saudi textbooks would want to massively exaggerate the death toll of the French Revolution.
In any case, I don't think it's controversial now to say that there was a very despotic system that ended up taking a hold after the French Revolution. And the very fascinating thing about this despotic government that differentiates it from others is that it was led by idealists, people who, at least at one point, were idealists. And Robespierre himself, before the execution of Louis and during the revolution, I believe, was even against the death penalty itself. So you can see this step-by-step development of this idealist who thinks, yeah, everyone should have those unalienable rights and dignity, and especially like abolishing the death penalty, abolishing slavery, obviously, is also one of them. And coming to a point, for example, where they have to decide what they're going to do with the king, I will say he is placed in a rather difficult position there, right? And I don't know where I would fall there on, to be honest. Yeah, I do consider myself to be someone who's against the death penalty, and at the same time, it is a very unenviable position, where you have this political instability, and you want to protect this revolution, you want to keep this republic from collapsing, and this is also something that you can take back to the Bolsheviks as well. And this step-by-step development of this idealist who's against killing people and against all of those things, going one step at a time to becoming a despotic tyrant. This is something that I really wish in the show was shown in the character arc of Daenerys Targaryen. Like, if I had to choose one thing that to label as the biggest missed opportunity, or the biggest, I could say, failure of the show, despite it being a great show, it is the lack of character development and relatability of Daenerys. Even though you do see some steps from this idealist to the despotic tyrant, there are way too few steps to be able to put yourself in that position and imagine yourself going to that horrible place. What do you think?
Yeah, on one level, yes, we did miss a lot, and I'm not sure how much of that has to do with GRR being elsewhere when the last seasons are being written. But when she executes a freedman for murdering a former master, that's definitely a turning point.
I think even that I can kind of understand.
But yeah, don't get me wrong, they didn't exactly have the resources to imprison people. It was a quick death. The punishment was just they don't get to live the last few years of their life, not that they go through agonizing pain first.
And I mean, she's trying to hold this state of law where people aren't allowed to kill each other. Those laws are to be applied to everyone equally, and this specific event would not fall within the purview of the critique that I'm making here. I think the lack of character development is mostly limited to the last season, honestly.
And they don't talk about logistics and supplies so much on the show. They do a little in the books. But how Lenin ordered the mass confiscation of grain, mostly in Ukraine, but in other places too. There was also a bit of a violation of the revolutionary ideals too, and that most certainly happened a lot with Daenerys' armies. We never hear about it, but it definitely happened a lot.
Confiscating grain. You never hear about it. Are you just making an assumption that this happens?
In Game of Thrones, yeah, they talk about the mountains men, especially the Tickler, torturing people to ask them, where is there any food anywhere? And talk about sending people to go foraging. And it is a task for goats and dogs, the mountain and Vargahot, not for lions. Tywin's younger brother was not supposed to go do it. It was supposed to be people lower than him who go forage for food amongst the peasantry. And yeah, and that's logistics coming into play. They don't have trucks. Even with trucks, the Russians can't feed their soldiers on the front line. Do we ever see oxen in there? Do they only have horses to work with?
I don't know. I don't know if you ever see bulls there or oxen.
I mean, they mention oryx, which are the wild ancestors of cattle, and were so large that they scared the shit out of Julius Caesar and his men when they encountered them in Gaul.
Yeah, but I do imagine that cattle would be.
But we never see them.
Do you even see beef or mention of beef or?
No, only the wild ancestors of cattle. And I suspect it went over the heads of at least 3/4 of the people who read the book, if not 90%. Don't have to know what an oryx is.
Definitely went over my head. I can't think of an instance where they use cattle, or do they drink milk?
Yeah, I think they mentioned cheese. That could be from goats, though. Was that an oversight? But yeah, it seems very strange that they never mentioned cattle, but Sam gets called an oryx by officer who trains them.
Yeah. Speaking of animals, is there any conception of animal rights in this universe?
I mean, considering what the Boltons can get away with doing to humans,
Yeah, you have a point there.
Eddard Stark definitely didn't think capriciously killing an animal was okay. Look at his response when Robert ordered Lady to be killed because Nymeria had bitten Joffrey.
Yeah, like it's been explained to me, but I still don't understand his decision to have to be the one to kill the dog. What kind of statement is it to do the thing that you're against having done?
Well,
It would be more of a clear message to say, if you have to do it, I want no part of it, and I'm not responsible for it, and I condemn it completely, and I want to be as far away from it as possible, or something
I
like that.
think in his case, I think he didn't trust anyone else to do it cleanly. I mean, I think he particularly didn't trust the executioner to do it properly. And I mean, in our world, executioners often were in charge of torture as well. And a lot of the executions were meant to be painful. Death was almost secondary. in the Game of Thrones universe. They just go right to beheading a lot. But I
Do you
think it
think
sounded like he just thought that having a butcher do it was unworthy, and he wanted to make sure the death was quick and painless. But I mean,
yeah, it's about preventing her from suffering?
yeah. And the first men, they also just thought it was hypocritical to sentence somebody to die and make someone else carry it out.
Yeah, that connection is what kind of puzzles me because there's this association between speaking the sentence and, taking the responsibility for this death and carrying out the sentence, right?
I think part of it was also that the Baratheons didn't still hold to that tradition, although their ancestors primarily first men.
Yeah. Yeah, but with the association between the sentencing and the execution, it's kind of feels like he's being a part of this execution or approving of this execution or
He said
yeah.
very clearly he didn't approve of it.
Yeah, maybe I'm being a bit pedantic about those things and the responsibility that someone has in doing something that someone else would do anyway, even though it might be morally questionable. And those situations where if I don't do it, someone else will, or they'll starve or not be cared for. So this general question of whether it's okay to do something like exploit child labor because either someone else will do it or they'll not be provided for at all, or like killing this dog when someone is going to do it either way. Yeah, this might be something that I have to think about more in my own moral worldview about taking part in fundamentally problematic actions that are going to occur anyway for utilitarian reasons.
And, well, I suspect it's coming up in Ukraine a fair amount right now.
Yeah, could you elaborate on that?
Oh, I'm sure there've been a lot of soldiers faced with we have these prisoners here. If they survive, the Rosvardi are going to torture them, or the Kadiravites are going to torture them, or some other batch of Putin's goons who aren't just regular military are going to torture them.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost wonder if any Ukrainians have been forced to make a similar decision because, well, a lot of Russian soldiers have targeted the wives of Ukrainian soldiers for rape and the parents of Ukrainian soldiers for torture. You gotta wonder if there's any Ukrainian soldiers who are going to do something horrible. Other Ukrainian soldiers need to take that into account when they're deciding whether to shoot some Russian soldiers or take them prisoner.
Yeah.
And, well, deliberately targeting soldiers' wives and parents for rape and torture, that almost sounds like they want them to respond in ways that are going to look bad in the media. You might have a little more insight on that than I do.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the decision to shoot someone instead of taking them prisoner because of what they done there.
No, I'm saying shoot someone instead of taking them prisoner because your comrades can't be trusted not to do something even worse.
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly. The last interesting points to speak about in Game of Thrones and the understanding in that world of universal human rights is the effect of Bran being king and the Iron Throne being melted down, and kind of an aside that's really inconsequential, but it was kind of amusing when Samuel Tarly suggested democracy in the council, and yeah, and everyone laughed at him. How far removed is that kind of thing from that world? Because I think that scene was very telling when it comes to the nobility's attitudes towards that.
At one level, the average peasant in our world would not have had any education, could not read. In Monty Python, The Holy Grail, where they have a peasant spouting socialist philosophy, the joke is that no peasant would know how to read, and therefore, even if such writings had even existed, wouldn't have been able to spout them. And it actually was a problem in England before the Norman conquest, where it was actually a problem when the inheritance of the aldermanship, which was basically something equivalent to a baron or a count or something, the system did not resemble late Middle Ages aristocratic ranking. But it was actually a problem because the son of an alderman would have grown up in an alderman's household. He would have seen how everything worked and would have known how to be an alderman from that. But when the king started choosing his favorites to be aldermen, they didn't have that experience and couldn't do the job. It didn't immediately cause problems, but as soon as they needed to be ready for ward, everything fell apart.
Yeah, and I get what you're saying when it comes to education in general, even though in the Middle Ages, like, was the nobility even largely literate?
Depends on where and when you're talking about, and paradoxically, it almost sounds like there was more literacy in the 900s than in the 1100s among the nobility.
There was more literacy among the nobility in the 900s than
Uh,
the 1100s. Wow.
at least in England, the Norman invasion and the nobility all speaking French while the common people spoke English kind of throws monkey wrenches into that.
I think this discussion of literacy is kind of a red herring when it comes to the right to a political participation. Kind of includes the right to be informed about the choices that one is to make, and yeah, even to be given the means to make those decisions effectively by things like campaigns, right? And also I think the eventual effect of the peasantry, yeah, wanting to have those resources in order to exercise political power.
And there's also a kind of a quirk of history that plays a role here too. A democratic representation of the peasants would have actually been a lot more feasible in Asia, where they had paper. They could actually have cheap books and an alphabet that was conducive to block printing, so you make stamps of every page of a book is feasible with kanji, but not so feasible with the Latin alphabet. And in the West, after Egypt was cut off, there's no longer papyrus, and the only thing to write on was animal skin, which is way too expensive for peasants to afford. And even after printing was invented, the first Gutenberg Bibles, some were printed on animal skin, some were printed on paper, and the paper one, you could buy 5 of those books for the cost of a house. It wasn't something a peasant could afford, nor would it be a good investment for them. Though simultaneously, a lot of peasants were actually very dependent on writing down how much people owed them and stuff too.
People have written on a lot of things historically than paper. Yeah, I think paper is an even less plausible grounding for that line of thinking than writing or literacy. So you think without any kind of widespread literacy, that kind of development wouldn't be feasible?
No. And I mean, farming is a complex job. If all those people laughing were told, go farm this land or you starve, every last one of them would have starved, too. Is also something to consider.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
while farmers starting to fight works a lot better than lords going to farm, both in Westeros and in our world.
yeah, yeah. That kind of makes sense on a practical level. When was it in the real world that people started having this conception of a universe,
I mean, the
political
Romans
power?
had a republic, although they didn't have complete equality in the republic. And when they got large number of slaves, as many historians argue, that was when the republic became unviable, both for having all those slaves and for economic reasons as a result of it. When you live in a tiny city-state of a few thousand people, democracy works very well. Democracy does not work with millions of people if you don't have decent communication. And I mean, printing presses will be decent enough communication when there's enough demand for printed works. There's actually a spike in the number of printing presses when all the when it was a new thing that all the nobles wanted to have in their collections. And then went down until the king started wanting people to print proclamations in mass, which then subsidized the printing of books. There's not a straight line in these things. Enough printed books, and if you can get to the point where you have newspapers, then you can have a democratic society of millions of people. I don't think it's doable before that. And in a city state of 10,000, the smartest people can speak into an assembly, or the smartest people about specific subjects, like somebody who's familiar with a city state that they might need to have relationships with. Somebody who's lived in that city state for a while and is a merchant there can inform everybody else about it quickly just by standing up and speaking to an assembly of the citizens in a way that's not until books are affordable. It just doesn't work in a society of millions to talk about another society of millions. You can't democratically make decisions on that large of a scale without books being readily available at the very least.
Yeah, that's a consideration I don't think I've ever thought about before, but it's also something I think I'll have to think about, because I don't know if I'm entirely convinced that it's not conceivable for this kind of organization, this bottom-up organization, to exist in a world without writing.
Yeah. Oh, if you want to have a bottom-up democratic society, it works as long as it's a small scale.
Yeah, on a large scale.
Yeah.
Whether that can work on a large scale, I don't know. It's an interesting question, and I think I'd like to look deeper into it. Again, if any listeners have some insights on the topic, do let us know.
A good place to start, I think, is the Tides of History podcast. They talk extensively about a lot of those things.
We're getting to 3 hours almost.
Yeah, we'll have to cut it back short. Yeah.
Anything important you'd like to cover more? Or
oh, did you see who they ended up creating? What the parallel to what they ended up creating in our world is at the end of the show?
What?
The Holy Roman Empire, where a handful of great lords choose the next king. A constitution that says 7 great lords choose the king in that Westeros, emperor in the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever made that connection. Amazing, yeah. Yeah, there are so many aspects to this that you can study all day.
Possible ending, they created the Holy Roman Empire. The only way it could be worse is if they created the Habsburgs, and then you could argue the Habsburgs practically were the Targaryens with all their incest.
But anyway, everybody, Merry Christmas to everyone.
Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa if you're celebrating that too, or Saturnalia or Yuletide, or whatever the Slavic version is, which I want to learn now. To our American listeners, don't freeze to death. Or our Ukrainian listeners, you too.
Yeah, stay safe out there. Goodbye.